When Prudence O'Malley placed the final stone on her husband's grave in the spring of 1876, she knew the whispers would start before the dirt had settled. What she didn't know was how quickly the town of Redemption Creek, Colorado, would turn its back on a woman with child and no husband to claim the babe growing in her belly. The morning sickness had begun just days before Thomas had been thrown from his horse and broken his neck. Now, 3 months after burying him, her condition was impossible to hide. The townsfolk did their arithmetic and found it wanting. Thomas O'Malley had been gone prospecting for 5 months before his death. The child Prudence carried couldn't possibly be his. Jezebel, they called her behind closed doors. Harlot, they whispered when she walked past. Prudence held her head high as she made her way down the muddy main street toward the general store, one hand resting protectively over her swollen middle. At 24, she had already lived through more hardship than most twice her age. She'd buried her parents, crossed half a continent in a wagon train, and now buried a husband. She would weather this storm too for her child's sake. Mrs. O'Malley. Mr. Peterson, the storekeeper, barely glanced at her as she approached the counter. "What'll it be today? Flour, please, and salt if you have it. Some coffee, too." Her voice was steady despite the chill in the air. Peterson moved with deliberate slowness, his back stiff with disapproval. "That'll be 75 cents. Prudence counted out the coins, painfully aware that they were among her last. Thomas had left some money, but not enough to last forever. The small cabin they'd built on the edge of town and the few acres around it were her only real assets. "I'll also need credit for a bolt of cloth," she said, keeping her voice even. "The baby will need no credit." Peterson cut her off sharply. "Cash only for your kind from now on." Heat rushed to her cheeks. "My kind? You know what I mean, Mrs. O'Malley." His voice dropped as a couple of women entered the store. This is a God-fearing town. Prudence gathered her purchases with shaking hands. 5 years she'd lived in Redemption Creek. 5 years of helping with church socials, nursing neighbors through illness, celebrating births and mourning deaths alongside these people who now looked at her as if she were a stranger worse, an abomination. She was almost to the door when Mrs. Carmichael, the mayor's wife, stepped directly into her path. "Prudence." The older woman's voice carried clearly through the now silent store. "The Ladies' Aid Society has been discussing your situation. We feel it would be best if you found somewhere else to raise your child. Redemption Creek has standards to uphold." Prudence felt as if she'd been slapped. "My husband is buried here." "Your husband has been dead for 3 months, Mrs. Carmichael replied coldly. "And that child you carry has been growing for at least 5. Don't insult our intelligence further." "I have nowhere else to go." The words escaped before Prudence could stop them. "That's hardly our concern, is it?" Mrs. Carmichael adjusted her shawl. "You made your choices." The air in the store grew thick and suffocating. Prudence pushed past the woman and fled into the street, barely noticing the spring mud that splashed her skirts. Tears blurred her vision as she hurried toward home, her purchases clutched against her chest. The cabin came into view as she rounded the bend in the road. It was modest, just 2 rooms with a stone chimney, but it was hers. Thomas had built it with his own hands, promising her it was just the beginning. They would add on as their family grew, he'd said. Now those dreams, like Thomas himself, were buried in the hard Colorado soil. As she approached, Prudence noticed a horse tethered outside a tall, dappled gray she didn't recognize. A man stood on her porch, his back to her as he knocked on her door. She slowed her pace, suddenly wary. Strangers weren't common in Redemption Creek, and strangers at her door even less so. As if sensing her presence, the man turned. He was tall, with shoulders broadened by years of hard work. His clothes were trail-worn but clean denim pants, a faded blue shirt, and a leather vest. A gun belt hung around his hips, the weapon seemingly at odds with the kindness in his eyes. Those eyes caught Prudence's attention immediately, a startling blue beneath the brim of his dust-covered hat. "Mrs. O'Malley." His voice was deep but gentle. She stopped several paces away, one hand instinctively moving to protect her unborn child. "Who's asking?" Wade Foster. He removed his hat, revealing sun-streaked brown hair. "I knew your husband." Prudence studied him cautiously. "Thomas never mentioned you." A shadow of something regret perhaps crossed the stranger's face. "We worked a claim together last year up near Silver Ridge. I've been away since then, just heard about what happened." He gestured vaguely toward the cemetery on the hill. "Came to pay my respects." Prudence shifted her packages, suddenly aware of how tired she was. "Well, now you have. If you'll excuse me, let me help you with those." Before she could protest, Wade Foster had crossed the distance between them and gently taken her bundles. "You shouldn't be carrying so much in your condition." The simple kindness so unexpected after the treatment in town nearly undid her. Prudence blinked rapidly to keep tears at bay as she moved past him to unlock her door. "Thank you, Mr. Foster. You can set those on the table." The cabin was neat but sparse. A bed with a colorful quilt stood in one corner. A table with 2 chairs occupied the center of the main room, while a small stove provided both heat and a cooking surface. Dried herbs hung from the rafters, and a few books, Thomas's Bible among them, sat on a small shelf. Wade placed the packages on the table with surprising care. His eyes swept the room, taking in details that revealed the precariousness of her situation, the near-empty woodpile visible through the window, the worn patches on the quilt, the single candle rather than a lamp. "Thomas spoke highly of you," he said, settling his hat on the table. "Said you were the bravest woman he'd ever known." Something in his tone made Prudence look at him sharply. There was no judgment there, no calculation, just a simple statement of fact. "Did he tell you I was a fool as well?" The words came unbidden, bitter and sharp. Wade's expression remained steady. "No, madam, he never said any such thing." Prudence turned away, busying herself with putting away her meager purchases. "Well, the rest of the town seems to think so. I noticed the reception you got at the store." His voice was quiet. "People can be quick to judge what they don't understand. They understand well enough." Prudence couldn't keep the edge from her voice. "A woman carrying a child that can't possibly be her dead husband's, the arithmetic is simple." Wade was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his words surprised her. Sometimes life isn't as simple as arithmetic. She turned to face him, this stranger who seemed to look at her without the condemnation she'd grown accustomed to. "What do you want, Mr. Foster?" "To help if I can." He met her gaze directly. "Thomas once helped me when I was in a bad way. I owe him." "You don't owe me anything." "Maybe not." Wade nodded toward her swollen belly. "But I reckon that little one is Thomas's family, and that means something to me." Before Prudence could respond, a sharp knock sounded at the door. She opened it to find Sheriff Miller standing on her porch, his expression grim. "Mrs. O'Malley." He nodded curtly, then peered past her. "Got word there was a stranger headed your way. Everything all right here?" "Mr. Foster was a friend of my husband's," Prudence explained, suddenly aware of how it might look a man in her home, alone. The sheriff's eyes narrowed. "Foster, is it? Don't believe I've seen you around these parts before." Wade stepped forward, his posture relaxed but somehow commanding. "Just passing through, Sheriff, paying my respects to an old friend." "Well, your respects have been paid." Miller's hand rested meaningfully on his gun belt. "Mrs. O'Malley's situation is delicate. Town's keeping an eye on things here." The implication hung in the air. Prudence was being watched, her every move scrutinized for further evidence of moral failing. "I appreciate the town's concern," Wade said, his voice carrying an edge now. "But seems to me a widow might need help rather than surveillance." The sheriff's jaw tightened. "We take care of our own in Redemption Creek." "Do you now?" Wade's smile didn't reach his eyes. Funny way of showing it. Tension crackled between the two men. Prudence stepped forward, suddenly fearful of what might happen. "Mr. Foster was just leaving, Sheriff." She gave Wade a pointed look. "Thank you for your condolences." Wade studied her face for a moment, then nodded. "Of course, Mrs. O'Malley." He retrieved his hat, settling it on his head as he moved toward the door. To the sheriff, he added, "I'll be in town for a few days. At the Silver Dollar if anyone needs me." After both men had gone, Prudence sank into a chair, one hand pressed against the small of her back where an ache had settled. The baby kicked, a reassuring flutter beneath her ribs. "It's just you and me, little one," she whispered. "We'll find a way." But as dusk settled over her lonely cabin, Prudence wondered just what that way might be. The town had made its position clear. Soon her funds would run out, and when the baby came, she pushed the thought away. One day at a time, that was all she could manage now. Outside, the wind picked up, whispering through the pines like judgment. Inside, Prudence O'Malley placed another log on the fire and prepared to face another night alone. The sound of chopping woke Prudence before dawn. She lay still for a moment, convinced she was dreaming. Then it came again, the distinctive thunk of an axe splitting wood. Moving carefully to avoid the floorboards that creaked, she took Thomas's old shotgun from beside the bed and approached the window. In the gray pre-dawn light, she made out a familiar figure at her woodpile. Wade Foster had stripped to his shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal muscled forearms as he methodically split logs and stacked them neatly. Prudence watched, bewildered, as he worked steadily through the pile of unsplit logs Thomas had left behind. By the time she dressed and kindled the stove for coffee, he had created a substantial stack of firewood enough to last her weeks. She opened the door just as he was setting the axe aside. "Mr. Foster." She kept her voice level despite her confusion. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" He wiped sweat from his brow with a handkerchief. "Good morning, Mrs. O'Malley. Hope I didn't wake you. You're cutting my wood." "Yes, madam," he nodded toward her belly. "Didn't seem right, you having to do it in your condition." Prudence felt a flash of irritation. "I've been managing just fine." "No doubt." His eyes met hers, steady and without challenge, but there's no shame in accepting help when it's offered freely. The aroma of coffee drifted from the open door. After a moment's hesitation, Prudence stepped back. "Would you like some coffee, Mr. Foster? Seems the least I can offer." A smile touched his lips. "Much obliged." Inside, Prudence poured 2 cups of the strong brew, watching as Wade Foster took a seat at her table. In the morning light, she could better see the lines around his eyes, the tiny scar that cut through his right eyebrow, the way his hands, rough and calloused, handled the delicate cup with surprising care. "Why are you really here, Mr. Foster?" she asked bluntly. "And don't tell me it's just to pay respects. Thomas has been dead for 3 months." Wade took a sip of coffee before answering. "Thomas saved my life once. We were working a claim that turned bad tunnel collapse. He pulled me out when he could have saved himself first." His fingers traced the rim of the cup. "I was in Montana when I heard. Came as soon as I could." It sounded plausible, yet something in his manner suggested there was more to the story. "Thomas never mentioned you," she said again. "No reason he should have." Wade's gaze was direct. It wasn't his way to boast about good deeds. That, at least, rang true. Thomas had been a quiet man, more comfortable with actions than words. "Still doesn't explain why you're chopping my wood at dawn." Wade set his cup down. "I saw how things stand in town. Heard some talk at the saloon last night." His jaw tightened briefly. "It isn't right how they're treating you. People believe what they want to believe," Prudence said, more resignation than bitterness in her tone now. "And what's the truth, Mrs. O'Malley?" The question was gentle, without accusation. Prudence stared into her coffee. She hadn't told anyone, there had been no one to tell. The truth was her burden alone, a secret she'd carried alongside the child in her womb. "The truth," she said finally, "is that this baby is Thomas's child." Despite what the calendar might suggest, she looked up, expecting to see doubt in his eyes. Instead, she found only patient attention. Thomas was home briefly, between prospecting trips. Just for 2 days, 5 months before he died. No one saw him because he arrived after dark and left before dawn. Her hands trembled slightly. "We were trying for a baby for 3 years. I didn't know it had finally happened until after he was gone for good." Wade nodded slowly. "Why not tell people that?" "I tried at first. No one believed me. They said I was lying to protect my reputation." A bitter laugh escaped her. "As if that matters now." "It matters," Wade said quietly. "Truth always matters." Prudence studied him, this stranger who seemed determined to champion her cause. "Even if it's a truth no one will believe." "Sometimes we don't live for what others believe," he replied. "We live for what we know to be right." The baby kicked then, a strong movement that made Prudence gasp slightly and press a hand to her side. Wade's eyes followed the motion, a strange expression crossing his face, something like longing mixed with resolve. "Mrs. O'Malley," he said carefully, "I know you have no reason to trust me, but I'd like to help if you'll let me." "Why would you do that?" Because Thomas would have wanted someone to look after his wife and child. He paused. And because it's the right thing to do. Prudence wanted to refuse. Pride demanded it, but reality was a harsh teacher, and she had learned its lessons well over these past months. She was alone, with dwindling resources and a community that had turned its back on her. The baby would come in 4 months' time, and then what? What kind of help are you offering, Mr. Foster? Whatever you need. He gestured toward the door. Wood for now. Maybe some repairs to the roof. I noticed it sagging in the corner. Game for your table. He hesitated, then added, and a name if you want it. Prudence stiffened. Excuse me, not marriage, he clarified quickly. Just, I could say the child is mine. Tell people we had an understanding before Thomas died. It wouldn't be the first time a man has stepped in to protect a woman's honor. The offer left her speechless. It was both incredibly generous and completely absurd. You'd lie for a woman you barely know. Sometimes a lie serves truth better than silence, Wade said simply. Besides, I owe Thomas more than I can repay. Before Prudence could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted them. Wade rose, moving to the window with the fluid grace of a man accustomed to potential danger. Reverend Williams, he said, identifying the rider. And he doesn't look pleased. Prudence sighed, setting her cup aside. He rarely is these days. The Reverend's knock was more of a pounding. When Prudence opened the door, his disapproving gaze moved immediately to Wade standing behind her. Mrs. O'Malley, his voice was cold. I see the rumors are true. Good morning, Reverend, Prudence replied evenly. What rumors would those be, that you have a man staying here? The Reverend's thin lips compressed further. Have you no shame, woman? Flaunting your sin even as you bear its evidence, Wade stepped forward before Prudence could respond. Reverend, I believe you're mistaken. I'm merely an old friend of Thomas's, paying my respects. At dawn, in her home alone, the Reverend's voice dripped with sarcasm. Do you take me for a fool, sir? Not at all, Wade replied coolly. Just for a man who might be quick to judge without facts. The Reverend drew himself up. The facts, as I understand them, are clear. This woman carries a child that cannot be her husband's. And now she entertains men in her home, unchaperoned. The child is Thomas's, Wade said firmly, and I'm not entertaining anyone. I'm helping a widow in need, as the good book instructs. You expect me to believe, I expect, Wade interrupted, his voice hardening, that a man of God would extend Christian charity rather than condemnation, especially to a woman in her condition. The two men stared at each other, neither willing to back down. Prudence felt the baby shift restlessly, as if sensing the tension. Reverend Williams, she said, breaking the silence, Mr. Foster was kind enough to chop wood for me this morning. He's having coffee before he returns to town. That's all. The Reverend's gaze moved between them, suspicion evident in every line of his face. The town council is meeting today, Mrs. O'Malley. Your situation will be discussed. My situation, Prudence echoed. Whether it's appropriate for you to remain in Redemption Creek given your moral failing. He straightened his coat. I would prepare yourself for the possibility of needing to find other accommodations. You're talking about running her out of town. Wade's voice was dangerously quiet. A pregnant widow. We are talking about upholding the moral standards of our community, the Reverend replied stiffly, something I would not expect a stranger to understand. Oh, I understand well enough. Wade took a step closer to the door. I understand that true Christianity means helping those in need, not casting stones. Be careful, sir. The Reverend's eyes narrowed. You know nothing of this woman or her circumstances. I know Thomas O'Malley was my friend, Wade replied, and that his wife and child deserve better than the treatment they're receiving. The Reverend's face flushed with anger. The council meets at noon. I suggest you both prepare yourselves. With that, he turned and stalked back to his horse. Prudence closed the door, leaning against it as if physically holding back the judgment of the town. You shouldn't have done that. Done what? Wade asked, returning to the table. Challenged him. The Reverend has considerable influence in Redemption Creek. Someone needs to challenge him. Wade's blue eyes were serious. What they're doing isn't right, Mrs. O'Malley. Prudence, she said suddenly. If you're going to keep chopping my wood and arguing with the town preacher, you might as well use my given name. A smile touched his lips. Prudence then, and I'm Wade. She nodded, then sank into a chair, one hand resting on her belly. They really might force me to leave, you know. The town was founded by the Reverend's father. His word carries weight. Where would you go? The question hung in the air between them, unanswerable. Prudence had no family, no close friends outside of Redemption Creek. What little money she had wouldn't last long on the road, especially with a baby coming. I don't know, she admitted finally. Wade's expression grew thoughtful. I have a proposition for you, Prudence. One that might solve several problems at once. Something in his tone made her wary. What kind of proposition? A marriage of convenience. The words fell into the quiet room like stones into still water. Prudence stared at him, certain she had misheard. You can't be serious. I am. Wade leaned forward, his expression earnest. Think about it. You need protection, legal and otherwise. That child needs a name that won't carry whispers, and he paused. I made a promise to Thomas that I would look after his family if anything happened to him. You never mentioned that before. Would you have believed me? Wade asked quietly. Prudence studied him, this man who had appeared out of nowhere with an impossible offer. I don't know you, Mr. Foster. No, he agreed. But you knew Thomas, and Thomas trusted me. You're asking me to marry a stranger. I'm offering you a solution. His voice was gentle but firm. It needn't be permanent. Once the child is born and the talk dies down, if you wish to go your own way, I won't stop you. Prudence rose, needing to move to think. The proposition was outrageous, and yet, was it any more outrageous than being driven from her home with a baby on the way? What would you get from this arrangement? She asked finally. Something flickered in Wade's eyes, a shadow of old pain, quickly masked. The chance to keep a promise. To do right by a friend. He hesitated, then added, and perhaps a measure of peace. Before she could question him further, a knock sounded at the door again. This time, when Prudence opened it, she found Mrs. Peterson, the storekeeper's wife, standing on her porch with a basket. Prudence. The woman's voice was hushed, her eyes darting nervously behind her. I brought you some things. Thomas was always kind to our boy when he had that fever last winter. I haven't forgotten. Prudence accepted the basket, touched by the unexpected kindness. Inside were jars of preserved fruits, a loaf of fresh bread, and several cuts of dried meat. Thank you, Martha. This is very generous. Mrs. Peterson glanced past her to where Wade stood. Is it true what they're saying, that this man is claiming to be the father? Prudence froze, caught off guard by the question. Before she could respond, Wade moved to stand beside her. Mrs. Peterson. He nodded politely. I'm Wade Foster, an old friend of Thomas's. The woman's eyes widened slightly. The one who saved him from the cave-in. Thomas spoke of you. Prudence glanced at Wade, surprised. He had been telling the truth about that, at least. Yes, madam, Wade confirmed. Though the way I recall it, he did most of the saving. Mrs. Peterson studied him for a moment, then looked back at Prudence. The town council is meeting today, about you. Her voice dropped. It won't go well, Prudence. The Reverend has been pushing for weeks to have you removed. On what grounds? Wade asked, his voice tight. Moral turpitude is the official reason. Mrs. Peterson's mouth twisted bitterly, but it's really about the Carmichael boy. Prudence felt as if the ground had shifted beneath her feet. What about Billy Carmichael? Mrs. Peterson glanced behind her again, clearly nervous about being seen. You truly don't know. Everyone assumes the child is his, that you and he were involved while Thomas was away. That's absurd. Prudence gasped. Billy Carmichael is barely 19 and the mayor's son. I've barely spoken 10 words to him. Which is why his mother is so determined to see you gone, Mrs. Peterson said grimly. She can't bear the suggestion that her precious son might have. She trailed off, color rising in her cheeks. Wade's hand came to rest lightly on Prudence's shoulder. The child is Thomas's, he said firmly, and soon to be my responsibility as well. Mrs. Peterson's eyebrows rose. What are you saying? I'm saying, Wade replied evenly, that Prudence has agreed to become my wife. We were waiting until an appropriate time had passed after Thomas's death, but it seems circumstances may force us to move more quickly. Prudence's head snapped toward him, but Wade's steady gaze silenced her protest. Is this true? Mrs. Peterson asked, looking to Prudence. Put on the spot, Prudence hesitated only briefly. Yes, she said, the word feeling strange on her tongue. Wade and we've come to an understanding. Mrs. Peterson's face registered shock, then something like relief. Well, that changes things considerably. She straightened her shawl. I should go before I'm missed, but Prudence, she hesitated. If this is true, you should make it official before the council meets. It would be harder for them to act against a married woman. After she had gone, Prudence closed the door and turned to Wade, her heart pounding. Why did you tell her that? Because it's what we need to do, he replied simply. And now we have even more reason to do it quickly. You can't seriously expect me to marry you today. I expect you to consider what's best for you and your child. Wade's voice was steady. The town is looking for an excuse to drive you out. This gives them a reason to back down without losing face. Prudence pressed a hand to her temple, feeling overwhelmed. This is madness. Sometimes madness is the only sane response to an insane situation. Wade moved closer, his expression earnest. Prudence, I know this isn't what you planned. It's not what I planned either, but Thomas was my friend, the closest thing to family I had. I couldn't save him, but I can help you now. By marrying me, a woman you've known for less than a day, by providing protection for you and that child. His gaze dropped to her belly. A child that deserves to come into this world with a father's name, whether it's mine by blood or not. Prudence sank into a chair, feeling the weight of the decision before her. To marry a stranger, it was unthinkable. And yet, what were her alternatives? To be driven from her home, to wander with a newborn and no resources, to face an uncertain future alone. If we did this, she said slowly, there would have to be conditions. Wade nodded, watching her carefully. Name them. This would be a marriage in name only. She met his gaze directly. I'm not looking for that, understood. And when the baby comes and the talk dies down, if I choose to end the arrangement, you won't contest it. Wade hesitated, then nodded again. If that's what you truly want when the time comes. Prudence took a deep breath. And one more thing. I want the truth, the whole truth about your relationship with Thomas. No more half-explanations or convenient stories. Wade's expression grew solemn. That's fair. He pulled out a chair and sat across from her. Thomas and I met 3 years ago working a claim near Silver Ridge. There was a cave-in, as I told you, and he did save my life. But that's not the whole story. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture that spoke of inner turmoil. Before that, I was not a good man, Prudence. I rode with some rough characters, did things I'm not proud of. His eyes met hers, unflinching. Thomas knew. He found out who I was, what I'd done, and instead of turning me in, he offered me a chance to start fresh. Why would he do that? Because he believed people could change, that everyone deserved a second chance. Wade's voice grew soft with memory. He made me promise that if I took that chance, I'd use it to do right by others, to pay forward the mercy he showed me. And did you? Change, I mean? I'm trying. Wade's smile was tinged with sadness. Every day. That's why I have to do this, Prudence, not just for Thomas, but for myself. To be the man he believed I could be. Prudence studied him, seeing beyond the surface for the first time the weight he carried, the redemption he sought. In that moment, she understood that this strange proposal wasn't merely about obligation or honor. It was about a man trying to fulfill a promise that went deeper than words. If we do this, she said finally, we do it honestly. No pretending to feelings that aren't there, agreed, and you need to understand something. Prudence placed both hands protectively over her belly. This child comes first, always. Wade nodded solemnly. As it should be. The clock on the mantel ticked steadily, marking the moments of this extraordinary conversation. Outside, the morning had brightened into full day. The town council would meet at noon. All right, Prudence said at last, scarcely believing the words as they left her lips. I'll marry you, Wade Foster. God help us both. The justice of the peace looked distinctly uncomfortable as Wade and Prudence stood before him in his small office an hour later. Word had spread quickly, Martha Peterson had seen to that, and curious faces peered through the windows, hungry for the spectacle of the scandalous widow and the mysterious stranger. Are you certain about this, Mrs. O'Malley? Justice Hammond asked quietly. There's no need to rush into something so permanent. I'm certain, Prudence replied, her voice steadier than she felt. Wade stood beside her, freshly shaved and wearing a clean shirt. He had returned to the hotel briefly to make himself presentable, while Prudence had changed into her best dress, the blue one she had worn to church, before the whispers had driven her away. "And you, Mr. Foster, you understand what you're taking on here." The justice's meaning was clear in his pointed glance at Prudence's swollen middle. "I understand perfectly," Wade answered, his voice firm. The ceremony was brief and devoid of sentiment, no flowers, no music, no loving promises. Just the stark legal words that would bind them together in the eyes of the law. When Justice Hammond pronounced them husband and wife, Wade leaned down and pressed a gentle kiss to Prudence's cheek, his hand steady at the small of her back. "Mrs. Foster," he murmured, and Prudence felt a strange flutter that had nothing to do with the baby. They emerged from the office to find a small crowd gathered in the street. Among them stood Reverend Williams, his face dark with displeasure, and Mayor Carmichael with his wife and son. The young man Billy looked uncomfortable, his eyes downcast as he shifted from foot to foot. "Well," Mayor Carmichael said, his voice carrying clearly in the tense silence, "it seems congratulations are in order." "Thank you, Mayor," Wade replied evenly, his hand still at Prudence's back. Mrs. Carmichael stepped forward, her expression a careful mask of propriety. "How fortunate that Mr. Foster arrived when he did. Almost providential, one might say." The implication was clear. She suspected the marriage was a hasty arrangement to legitimize Prudence's condition. "Yes," Prudence agreed, meeting the woman's gaze directly. "God works in mysterious ways." The Reverend cleared his throat. "The council meeting is still scheduled for noon, Mayor. This development changes nothing about the moral situation." "On the contrary," Wade interjected smoothly. "It changes everything. My wife," he emphasized the word, "is now under my protection, as is our child." The deliberate claims silenced the murmurs that had begun to ripple through the crowd. Billy Carmichael's head snapped up, his eyes wide as they met Prudence's briefly before darting away. "Your child," Mrs. Carmichael repeated, her voice sharp. "Yes," Wade confirmed. "Prudence and I had an understanding before her husband's death. We waited out of respect for Thomas, but circumstances have forced our hand." His gaze swept the crowd, challenging anyone to contradict him. "I trust that ends any misunderstandings about the situation." Mayor Carmichael tugged at his wife's arm. "Margaret, I believe we should cancel the council meeting. There's clearly no need for it now." But the Reverend began to protest. "No need at all," the mayor repeated firmly, giving the preacher a meaningful look. "Mr. and Mrs. Foster should be allowed to begin their married life in peace." As the crowd dispersed, Prudence felt Wade's hand tighten slightly at her waist. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly. She nodded, though in truth she felt light-headed. In the space of a morning, she had gone from reviled widow to married woman. The ground beneath her feet seemed as uncertain as her future. "Let's go home," she said softly, suddenly weary of the staring eyes and whispered comments. "Home." The word took on new meaning as they walked back to the cabin together. No longer her solitary refuge, but a space she would now share with this man who was both stranger and husband. Wade seemed to sense her unease. As they approached the cabin, he paused. "I can sleep in the barn if you prefer." Prudence considered the offer. It would be the proper thing to do, given the unusual nature of their arrangement. And yet, the thought of explaining to curious neighbors why her new husband slept apart from her seemed more troublesome than sharing the small space. "No," she decided. "That would only start new gossip, but I'll need to make up a pallet for you." Wade nodded, accepting her terms without argument. "I should fetch my things from the hotel and perhaps stop by the general store for supplies." "With what money?" Prudence asked practically. "I've barely enough to last the month." A smile touched Wade's lips. "I'm not without resources, Prudence. Thomas and I did well on that last claim." For the first time, Prudence considered the practical aspects of this strange union. "What do you do, Wade Foster?" "When you're not marrying women you've just met." His laugh was unexpected, a warm, genuine sound that transformed his face. "Lately, I've been working as a guide for hunting parties. Before that, mining, cattle driving, whatever honest work I could find." His expression grew more serious. "I'm not a wealthy man, but I'm not a burden either. We won't go hungry." The simple declaration reassured her more than flowery promises might have. Prudence watched as he mounted his horse, raising a hand in farewell as he headed back toward town. Alone in the cabin once more, she moved about in a daze, trying to reconcile the morning's events with the new reality of her life. Her hand drifted to her wedding ring, Thomas's ring, which she had never removed. Now it was joined by a second band, hastily purchased from the jeweler before the ceremony. 2 rings, 2 husbands, one dead and buried, one very much alive and returning soon with his belongings. "What have I done?" she whispered to the empty room. The baby kicked in response, a strong movement that reminded her exactly why she had agreed to this arrangement. For this child, Thomas's child, she would do whatever was necessary, even marry a man she barely knew. When Wade returned an hour later, his saddlebags full and a crate of supplies balanced before him, Prudence had composed herself. She had made up a pallet in the corner of the main room and put on a pot of stew with the last of her vegetables. "Smells good," Wade remarked as he carried in his belongings. Prudence noticed that he brought some clothes, a few books, a rifle in a worn leather case, the mark of a man accustomed to moving on. "I hope you like rabbit stew," she said, stirring the pot. "It's what we have." "One of my favorites." Wade set down a package wrapped in brown paper. "I brought a few things from town: flour, coffee, sugar, some bacon and beans." He hesitated, then added, "and this." He unwrapped a small bundle to reveal a wooden carving of a horse beautifully crafted, with flowing mane and tail. "For the baby," he explained, looking suddenly unsure. "Every child needs something to dream with." The simple gift caught Prudence off guard. She reached out to touch the smooth wood, moved by the thoughtfulness behind it. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "Thank you." Wade nodded, looking relieved. "I thought we might put a shelf up over there." He gestured to the wall near the bed. "For the baby's things." The casual the assumption of shared future and purpose struck Prudence with unexpected force. This man, this stranger who was now her husband, was already thinking of ways to make space for her child. "That would be nice," she agreed, her voice not quite steady. They ate dinner in a strange, careful silence, each watching the other for cues. Wade cleared his throat several times as if to speak, then seemed to think better of it. Prudence found herself studying him when he wasn't looking, the way he handled his spoon with unexpected grace, the small scar on his left thumb, the way his hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck. "Tell me about yourself," he said finally, breaking the silence. "Thomas spoke of you, but I'd like to hear your story in your own words." Prudence set down her spoon, considering the request. "There's not much to tell. I grew up in Ohio. My parents died of fever when I was 19. I came west with my uncle's family, met Thomas at a church social in Denver, and married him 6 months later." She ran a finger along the edge of her bowl. "We settled here because Thomas heard there was silver in the hills. He built this cabin, promised me we'd have a proper house someday when his claim paid off. He was a good man," Wade said quietly. "Yes." Prudence felt the familiar ache of loss. "He was, and you loved him." It wasn't a question, but Prudence answered anyway. "I did. Not in the wild way you read about in novels, but in a steady way that felt like it could last forever." She looked up, meeting Wade's gaze. "I never expected to be a widow at 24. Life rarely gives us what we expect," Wade replied, his eyes shadowed with something that looked like old grief. "Sometimes it gives us something better, sometimes worse, but always different." "And what did you expect from life, Wade Foster?" Prudence asked, curious about this man who had so abruptly become central to her existence. Wade was silent for a long moment. "Once I expected to die young and violent," he said finally. "Now I'm not so sure." The stark honesty of his answer surprised her. "What changed, Thomas?" Partly. Wade's smile was tinged with sadness. "And growing tired of the man I saw in the mirror each morning." Prudence sensed there was more to the story, much more, but she didn't press. There would be time enough for that. Strange as it seemed, they had a lifetime ahead of them, or at least until she chose to end their arrangement. As darkness fell, the awkwardness between them grew. Wade busied himself with banking the fire while Prudence prepared for bed, changing into her nightgown behind the privacy screen in the corner. "I'll just..." Wade gestured toward the pallet he had arranged near the stove. Yes, of course. Prudence slipped under the quilt of her bed, their bed, by right, though neither of them seemed ready to acknowledge that fact. Wade removed his boots and outer shirt, leaving him in his undershirt and trousers as he stretched out on the pallet. The cabin creaked and settled around them, the only sound besides their careful breathing. "Good night, Prudence," Wade said finally, his voice quiet in the darkness. "Good night." Prudence turned on her side, facing the wall, acutely aware of the man lying just feet away. Her husband, in name if nothing else. Sleep was slow in coming, her mind too full of the day's extraordinary events. Somewhere in the dark hours before dawn, she drifted off, one hand resting protectively over her unborn child. In her dreams, Thomas smiled at her from a distance, nodding in approval at the strange turn her life had taken. The next few weeks established a routine that was both comforting and strange. Wade rose before dawn each day, tending to chores before Prudence was even awake. He repaired the sagging corner of the roof, fixed the broken step on the porch, and built a sturdy cradle from pine boards that he carefully sanded until they were smooth as silk. Prudence, in turn, kept the cabin, cooked their meals, and worked in the small garden patch where she grew herbs and vegetables. They moved around each other carefully, like dancers learning an unfamiliar step. In town, the initial furor over their sudden marriage gradually gave way to grudging acceptance. Wade's steady presence at Prudence's side, his quiet insistence that the child she carried was his responsibility, slowly changed perceptions. Not everyone was convinced. Reverend Williams remained cool during Sunday services, and Mrs. Carmichael pointedly avoided them, but the open hostility had faded. One evening in late May, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of gold and crimson, Prudence felt the baby shift and roll within her. "Oh," she gasped, pressing a hand to her side. Wade looked over quickly, concern in his eyes. "Are you all right?" "Yes, just here." Without thinking, she reached for his hand and placed it against her belly where the baby was kicking. Wade went perfectly still, his eyes widening as he felt the strong movement beneath his palm. Something crossed his face, wonder, mixed with a deeper emotion Prudence couldn't name. "That's amazing," he whispered. Prudence realized suddenly what she had done, the intimacy of the gesture, the way it blurred the careful boundaries they had established. She started to pull away, but Wade's hand followed the movement, staying connected to her. "Is it always like this?" he asked, his voice hushed. "Lately, yes. Especially in the evenings. Thomas's child is going to be a night owl, I think." Wade's expression shifted at the mention of Thomas, his hand finally dropping away. He would have been so proud. Yes, Prudence smoothed her dress over her rounded belly. He wanted children very much. They sat in silence for a while, the evening deepening around them. Fireflies began to blink in the gathering dusk, their tiny lights dancing above the grass. "I never thought I'd have children," Wade said suddenly, his voice so low Prudence almost didn't hear him. "Why not?" he shrugged, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. "The life I led. It wasn't one you brought innocent lives into." Something in his tone made Prudence wonder again about the man he had been before Thomas changed his path. She had pieced together bits of his past from things he'd said, references to hard years, bad choices, lessons learned at too high a cost. "And now," she asked carefully, Wade glanced at her, then back to the horizon. "Now I think about it sometimes, what it might be like to teach a boy to fish or ride, to see the world fresh through a child's eyes." The admission seemed to cost him something, a vulnerability revealed that he usually kept hidden. Prudence felt an unexpected surge of tenderness toward this man who slept on a pallet in her home, who worked from dawn to dusk to make their life comfortable, who spoke of her unborn child with such careful respect. "You'll be good with children," she said softly. "You have gentle hands." Wade looked at her then, surprise evident in his face. "Do I?" "Yes. I've watched you with the Hendersons' little girl when they come to visit, and the way you carved that horse for the baby, those aren't the actions of a man who doesn't understand children." A smile touched his lips. "Thank you for saying that." Something shifted between them in that moment, a warming of the careful distance they had maintained. a recognition of the strange intimacy that had grown between them despite the artificial nature of their union. The baby kicked again, and this time Prudence didn't hesitate to share the moment. "Here," she said, guiding his hand once more. "Feel that? I think it's an elbow." Wade's smile deepened as he felt the movement. "Strong," he commented, "like its mother." The compliment brought unexpected heat to Prudence's cheeks. She was saved from responding by the sound of approaching riders. Wade was on his feet instantly, his hand moving to the gun at his hip, a habit Prudence had noticed that he couldn't seem to break despite the relative peace of their lives. "It's Sheriff Miller," he said, peering into the gathering darkness, "and someone else I don't recognize." Prudence rose awkwardly, one hand supporting her back. The pregnancy was advancing, making even simple movements more challenging. What would the sheriff want at this hour? The riders drew up to the cabin, dust from the trail settling around them in the still evening air. Sheriff Miller nodded a curt greeting, while the second man, a stranger with a hard face and official-looking manner, surveyed the property with calculating eyes. "Foster," Miller said, dismounting. "Mrs. Foster, this here is Marshal Blackwood from Denver. He's looking for information about a man who might have passed through these parts." Wade's posture remained relaxed, but Prudence noticed the slight tension in his shoulders. "Evening, Sheriff. Marshal, how can we help you?" The marshal dismounted, his movements deliberate. "I'm tracking a man named William Farley. Armed robber, suspected of at least 2 murders in Colorado territory. Word is he worked a mining claim near Silver Ridge a few years back." Prudence felt rather than saw Wade's slight stillness at the name. "Can't say I know the man," he replied evenly. "Silver Ridge is a fair distance from here." The marshal's eyes narrowed. "Funny thing is, a fellow over in Silverdale seemed to think Thomas O'Malley might have known him, said they worked a claim together." At the mention of Thomas's name, Prudence stepped forward. "My late husband worked many claims, Marshal. He didn't always speak of the men he met." "No, madam, I expect not." The marshal's gaze shifted to Wade. "And you, Foster, you knew O'Malley, I understand." "I did. But never came across this Farley character." Wade shook his head. "Can't recall the name." The marshal studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "Well, if you happen to remember anything, you let Sheriff Miller know. Farley's a dangerous man. There's a reward for information leading to his capture." "We'll keep that in mind," Wade replied. After the lawman had ridden away, Prudence turned to Wade, a question in her eyes. He shook his head slightly, warning her to silence until he was certain the riders were truly gone. Inside the cabin, with the door closed and the curtains drawn, Wade paced the small space like a caged animal. "You know this man they're looking for," Prudence said. It wasn't a question. Wade stopped pacing, his back to her as he stared into the fire. "I knew him. Was he a friend of yours from before?" "No," Wade's voice was hard. "He was never a friend." Prudence moved closer, sensing there was more to the story, something important that Wade wasn't saying. "Then why did the marshal's questions disturb you?" Wade turned to face her, his expression guarded. "Because William Farley is dead, has been for almost 3 years. How do you know that?" The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken truths. When Wade finally spoke, his voice was low and strained. "Because I killed him." The admission hung in the air, changing everything. Prudence sank into a chair, one hand instinctively moving to protect her unborn child. "You killed him," she repeated numbly. Wade nodded, his eyes never leaving her face, watching for her reaction. "It wasn't murder, it was self-defense. He tried to rob the camp Thomas and I had set up, shot at us when we caught him stealing our supplies. And Thomas, was he? He was there. He witnessed it." Wade's hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. "He's the one who insisted we bury Farley properly instead of leaving him for the coyotes. Said every man deserved that much dignity, no matter what he'd done." The story fit with what Prudence knew of Thomas, his deep sense of decency, his belief in treating even enemies with basic humanity. But it raised more questions than it answered. If it was self-defense, why not report it to the authorities? Wade hesitated, then said simply, "Because I was wanted myself in those days. Going to the law would have meant hanging for crimes I'd committed before." "What crimes?" Prudence whispered, suddenly afraid of the answer. "Robbery, assault. I rode with a bad crowd after the war." Wade's voice was flat, emotionless. I never killed anyone who wasn't trying to kill me first, but that wouldn't have mattered to a judge. Prudence tried to reconcile this revelation with the man she had come to know, the man who fixed her roof, who carved toys for her unborn child, who treated her with unfailing respect. Thomas knew all this, and still befriended you. Yes, a ghost of a smile touched Wade's lips. He said everyone deserved a second chance, that God wasn't finished with me yet. And the marshal, why is he looking for Farley now if he's been dead for years? Wade shook his head. I don't know, maybe someone found the grave, or maybe someone's using Farley's name for new crimes. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Prudence had come to recognize as a sign of inner turmoil. Either way, it's trouble. If they connect me to Farley's disappearance, he didn't need to finish the thought. If authorities discovered Wade had killed a man even in self-defense, they might look more closely into his past, and that could lead to disaster for both of them. What do we do? Prudence asked, surprising herself with the we. Despite everything, she found herself unwilling to abandon this man who had stood by her when no one else would. Wade looked at her, something like wonder in his expression. You're not telling me to leave. Would it help if I did? It might be safer for you. Prudence shook her head. I made vows, Wade, for better or worse. Those weren't real vows, Prudence. This isn't a real marriage. It's real enough to the town, real enough that I'm no longer being driven from my home. She met his gaze steadily. And real enough that I won't turn my back on you now. Wade crossed the room in 2 strides, kneeling before her chair. You don't owe me that kind of loyalty, don't I? Prudence's hand came to rest on his shoulder. You gave me back my life, my home, my dignity. You claimed a child that isn't yours. Why would you do all that if not out of loyalty to Thomas? It wasn't just for Thomas, Wade admitted quietly. Then why? He hesitated, searching for words. Because when I saw you that first day so alone, so determined despite everything I knew I had to help. Not just because of my promise to Thomas, but because it was the right thing to do. The kind of thing the man I'm trying to become would do. The simple honesty of his answer moved Prudence deeply. Without thinking, she leaned forward and pressed her lips to his forehead, a gesture of comfort, of acceptance. Wade went still beneath her touch, his breathing shallow. When she pulled back, his eyes were dark with emotion. We'll figure this out, she said softly. Together. He nodded, rising to his feet. I should check the horses. Make sure everything's secure for the night. Prudence watched him go, aware that something fundamental had shifted between them. The careful distance they had maintained was crumbling, replaced by something more complex, a shared purpose, a mutual protection, perhaps even the beginnings of true affection. That night, as she lay in bed listening to Wade's steady breathing from his pallet across the room, Prudence wondered about the strange turns life could take. 6 months ago, she had been a simple wife waiting for her husband to return from his latest prospecting trip. Now she was a widow, soon to be a mother, married to a man with a dangerous past who slept on her floor. And yet, despite everything, she felt safer than she had in months. Protected, not alone, the baby shifted within her, a gentle reminder of the life to come. Prudence rested her hand on her belly, whispering a silent promise to her child. Whatever happened, she would ensure this baby was born into safety and love, even if that meant standing by Wade Foster against whatever shadows pursued him from the past. The marshal's visit cast a pall over the next few weeks. Wade grew more vigilant, checking and rechecking the property's perimeter each evening, keeping his gun closer at hand. Prudence noticed how his eyes scanned every unfamiliar face when they went to town, the way he positioned himself between her and potential danger. Summer settled over the valley, bringing with it sweltering days that made Prudence's advancing pregnancy even more uncomfortable. By July, she was in her 8th month, her belly so large that simple tasks became challenges. Wade quietly took on more of the household duties, never commenting when he found her resting in the shade or napping in the afternoon heat. One particularly hot evening, Prudence sat at the table shelling peas while Wade cleaned his rifle nearby. The familiar domestic scene struck her suddenly how normal it had become to share this space, these tasks, this life with him. Wade, she said, breaking the comfortable silence. What happens after the baby comes? His hands stilled on the gun. What do you mean, our arrangement? Prudence kept her eyes on the peas, finding it easier to speak without looking at him. We agreed that after the baby was born and the talk died down, I could end our marriage if I chose. Yes, his voice was carefully neutral. That was our agreement. Is that still what you want? Wade set the rifle aside, giving her his full attention. What I want doesn't matter. I made you a promise. It matters to me, Prudence insisted, finally looking up. I need to know what you're thinking. Wade was silent for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. I'm thinking that I've come to care for you, Prudence, more than I expected to, more than is probably wise, given our situation. The admission hung in the air between them, honest and vulnerable. Prudence felt a flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with the baby. I've come to care for you too, she said softly. Wade's eyes held hers, searching for something. Enough to consider making this marriage real, not just in name but in truth. Before Prudence could answer, a sharp knock at the door interrupted them. Wade was on his feet instantly, motioning for her to stay seated as he moved to answer it. Sheriff Miller stood on the porch, his expression grim. Foster, Mrs. Foster. Sorry to disturb your evening, but there's been some trouble in town. What kind of trouble? Wade asked, his body blocking the doorway protectively. Fight at the saloon. Man got killed. The sheriff's eyes were hard. Stranger passing through went by the name of Davis. Before he died, he said some interesting things about you, Foster. Prudence rose awkwardly, moving to stand behind Wade. What things? Said he recognized you from somewhere else. Said you used to go by a different name. Miller's hand rested meaningfully on his gun belt. Said you were wanted in Wyoming territory. Wade remained perfectly still. And you believe the word of a dead drunk. I believe it's worth looking into. The sheriff's gaze moved between them. Marshal Blackwood's been sent for. He'll be here in a few days to sort it out. After Miller had gone, Wade closed the door and leaned against it, his face drawn. I have to leave, he said flatly. No, Prudence moved closer, her belly brushing against him. We can explain. If it was self-defense with Farley, it's not just Farley. Wade's voice was tight with tension. There are other things in my past, Prudence, things I'm not proud of. If the marshal starts digging, then we'll face it together. She placed a hand on his arm. You're not that man anymore. Wade covered her hand with his own. The law doesn't care who I am now, only who I was. Then we'll leave, Prudence said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. Both of us, before the marshal arrives. Prudence, no, you're 8 months pregnant. The baby could come any day. It's not safe for you to travel. It's not safe for me to stay if you go, she countered. The town barely tolerates me now, without you. She shook her head. I won't go back to that. Wade studied her face, conflict clear in his eyes. You'd leave your home for me? This is just a cabin, Wade. Home is. She hesitated, then finished simply. Home is where we're together. Something broke open in Wade's expression, a mixture of wonder and fear, and something deeper that made Prudence's heart race. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he lowered his head and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was gentle, questioning, and over almost before it began. Wade drew back, watching her face carefully. I've wanted to do that for weeks, he admitted. Prudence touched her fingers to her lips, surprised by how right it had felt. I think I've wanted you to. Wade's arms came around her, as much as her belly would allow, and this time when he kissed her, there was nothing hesitant about it. Prudence felt herself respond with unexpected hunger, months of loneliness and fear giving way to this new, startling desire. When they finally parted, both breathing heavily, Wade rested his forehead against hers. If we do this, if we leave, there's no coming back. It would have to be a fresh start somewhere far from here. I know. We'd have to travel fast before the marshal arrives. That means leaving most of your things behind. Prudence thought of the small treasures she had accumulated over the years, her mother's china tea set, Thomas's books, the quilt they had slept under during their marriage, all the tangible reminders of her past life. I can bring what matters most, she said. The rest is just things. Wade searched her face, looking for doubt or hesitation. Finding none, he nodded slowly. We'll leave tomorrow at first light, head west into the mountains, then north. I know places where we won't be found. That night, as Prudence packed what little they could carry, clothes, some food, a few precious mementos, she felt a strange sense of rightness settle over her. This choice, this man, this new beginning, it wasn't what she had ever imagined for herself, but it felt like the path she was meant to take. Wade worked alongside her, efficient and focused, pausing occasionally to check the windows or listen for approaching riders. In the small hours before dawn, when their preparations were complete, he took her hands in his. "Are you sure about this, Prudence? Truly sure?" "It's not too late to change your mind." In answer, she rose on tiptoe and kissed him, pouring into the gesture all the certainty she felt. "I'm sure," she whispered against his lips. "Wherever you go, I go too." As the first pale light of dawn touched the eastern sky, a wagon rolled away from the small cabin by the creek. Inside, Prudence sat beside Wade, her hand in his, facing forward toward an uncertain but shared future. Behind them, Redemption Creek stirred to life, unaware that two of its residents had slipped away in the night, leaving behind a life that no longer fit the people they had become. The mountain trails were rough, jostling Prudence painfully as Wade guided the wagon through terrain too remote for regular travelers. They avoided main roads and settlements, camping in hidden valleys and dense forest clearings. Each night, Wade built a small fire and made Prudence as comfortable as possible, his hands gentle as he helped her find a position that eased the ache in her back. On the fourth day, as they crossed a high meadow dotted with wildflowers, Prudence felt the first true contraction grip her. She gasped, clutching at her belly. "Wade," she managed when the pain had passed. "I think the baby's coming." He reined the horses to a halt, his face paling beneath his tan. "Now, here, not right this minute." Prudence tried to smile despite her fear. "But soon, today, maybe tomorrow." Wade surveyed their surroundings with new urgency. "There's a place about 2 hours ahead, an old trapper's cabin I stayed in once. It's rough, but it's shelter." The next contraction came sooner than Prudence expected, stronger than the first. She bit her lip to keep from crying out, not wanting to add to Wade's obvious concern. "Hang on," he urged, flicking the reins to urge the horses to a faster pace. "Just a little longer." The 2 hours stretched into 3 as Wade was forced to navigate carefully over increasingly difficult terrain. By the time the cabin came into view, a low, sturdy structure of logs and stone nestled against a cliff face. Prudence's contractions were coming regularly, each one stealing her breath. Wade helped her inside, his arms strong around her waist. The cabin was dusty but sound, with a stone fireplace and a rough-hewn bed frame still intact. He worked quickly, spreading their bedding on the frame, building a fire, fetching water from the nearby stream. "I don't know much about birthing babies," he admitted as he helped her settle onto the bed, "but I'll do whatever you need." Prudence grabbed his hand as another contraction seized her. "Just stay with me," she gasped. "Don't leave." "Never," Wade promised, his eyes fierce with determination. Not for anything. The labor progressed rapidly, as if the baby sensed the urgency of their situation. Prudence tried to remember what she'd seen as women in town gave birth: the breathing, the pushing, the necessary preparations. Wade followed her instructions without question, his face set in lines of concentration as he heated water, tore clean cloth into strips, and positioned himself to help. As the sun began to set, painting the small cabin in golden light, Prudence felt the overwhelming urge to push. Wade knelt between her legs, his hands steady despite the fear in his eyes. "I can see the head," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're doing it, Prudence, just a little more." With a final, powerful effort, Prudence felt the baby slip from her body into Wade's waiting hands. There was a moment of terrifying silence, and then a strong, indignant cry filled the cabin. "A girl," Wade announced, his voice breaking. "A perfect little girl." He laid the squalling infant on Prudence's chest, where she instinctively curled her tiny fists against her mother's skin. Prudence stared down at her daughter through tears of exhaustion and joy, the dark hair already showing a tendency to curl, the button nose, the rosebud mouth so like Thomas's. "She's beautiful," Wade whispered, awe in his voice as he gently touched the baby's head. "What will you call her?" Prudence looked up at this man who had risked everything for her and her child, who had delivered her daughter with hands that shook only with emotion, not fear. "Hope," she decided. "Her name is Hope," Wade's eyes filled with tears. It's perfect, she's perfect. Later, after he had helped clean both mother and child, after the afterbirth had been delivered and properly buried, after Hope had nursed for the first time, Wade sat beside them on the bed, his back against the wall and Prudence leaning against his chest. "I never thought I'd have this," he said softly, his fingers gently stroking Hope's tiny hand where it gripped his thumb. "A family. Is that what we are?" Prudence asked, tilting her head to look up at him. "A family," Wade met her gaze, all pretense and caution gone from his expression. "It's what I want us to be, not because of promises or arrangements or obligations, but because I love you, Prudence, both of you." The words, so simply spoken, filled a space in Prudence's heart she hadn't realized was empty. "I love you too," she whispered. "I think I have for a while now." Wade's kiss was tender, reverent, the kiss of a man who understood the precious gift he had been given and vowed never to take it for granted. Outside, night fell over the mountains, stars appearing one by one in the vast Colorado sky. Inside the small cabin, a family slept: a man who had found redemption through love, a woman who had found strength through adversity, and a tiny girl whose very name embodied the promise of their future together. In the years that followed, Wade and Prudence Foster built a life far from the judgments of Redemption Creek. They settled in a small valley in northern Wyoming, where Wade's skills as a hunter and guide earned them a modest but comfortable living. Prudence planted a garden that grew more bountiful each year, and eventually opened a small school for the children of neighboring homesteads. Hope grew into a spirited child with her mother's determination and her adoptive father's kind heart. She never knew that Wade was not her blood father to her. He was simply Papa, the man who taught her to ride and fish, who built her dolls and read her stories, who looked at her mother with unwavering devotion. 2 brothers joined her in time: Thomas, named for the man who had set their family's story in motion, and Daniel, whose arrival during a blizzard had turned Wade's hair a shade grayer overnight. Sometimes, on quiet evenings when the children were asleep, Prudence would find Wade on the porch, looking up at the stars with a thoughtful expression. "Any regrets?" she would ask, settling beside him, and always his answer was the same as he pulled her close and pressed a kiss to her temple. Not a single one. For in losing everything: home, security, the past, they had found something far more valuable, a love born of choice rather than circumstance, strengthened by challenges overcome together, and sustained by the family they had created against all odds. It wasn't the life either of them had imagined. It was better.